The surrender order went out across 40 systems at once, and every voice that mattered in the galaxy agreed it was generous. Young Tavi Wren, of the Seleucan Marches, was 11 seasons old when the order was read aloud in the listening hall, and she would remember the exact words for the rest of her long life. The hall was a bowl of pale stone, carved into the side of a tide moon, and 3,000 of her people sat in its tiers, breathing the same warm air, watching the same broad screen. The order came from the Pale Throne, from the High Cantor himself, and it was beamed to every world the throne claimed, and every world it intended to claim soon. It was, the adults around Tavi murmured, a kindness. It was the most merciful thing the throne had ever done. The order had a name. They called it the Quiet Hand. It said that the small human worlds along the Seleucan Marches had 30 days to lay down their weapons, open their docks, and send their leaders to the throne to kneel. In return, no world would burn, no people would be hunted. The humans would simply become a column in the throne's great roll, a tithe people, a useful folk who would build ships and grow grain, and never again imagine themselves free. 30 days, kneel, and live. It was generous, because the throne did not have to offer anything at all. Tavi did not understand all of it. She was a child of a quiet colony, and her people were not human. They were Seleucan, slow-blooded and patient, with skin like wet slate, and 4 soft eyes that saw heat as easily as light. Her people had lived under the Pale Throne for 200 years, and they had learned the one lesson the throne taught best, which was that you knelt early, and you knelt deep, and you did not make the throne ask twice. So when the humans of the Marches did not answer the Quiet Hand on the first day, the listening hall went very still, and when they did not answer on the second day, the adults began to whisper that the humans were fools. And when the 5th day passed, and the 6th, and the human world sent back nothing at all, not a word, not a plea, not even a curse, Tavi's grandmother took her 4 hands in her own and said, in the old soft tongue, that the humans were already dead and simply had not lain down yet. Tavi believed her. Everyone did. The Pale Throne had broken 11 peoples in living memory. It had a fleet called the Cantor's Wide Hand, 80,000 ships strong, that moved like a single closing fist, and behind that fleet were the Hunt Lords, the throne's favored killers, who did not fight wars so much as conduct harvests. The Hunt Lords had a saying that the humans were about to learn. They said that the only sound a conquered world made was the sound it made when it stopped. The humans were small. Their worlds along the Marches numbered 9, and they were new worlds, thin worlds, with no great fleet that anyone had ever seen. They had come into this arm of the galaxy only 60 years before, quiet settlers in slow gray ships, and they had built farms and waterworks and small clean cities, and they had asked for nothing and threatened no one. The throne had watched them the way a patient thing watches a field it intends to reap, and now the field had been told to lie down for the blade, and the field had said nothing. For 10 days, Tavi's whole world was the listening hall, and the broad screen, and the slow countdown the throne ran in the corner of it. A string of pale numbers ticking down the 30 days the humans had been given. Each morning the number was smaller, and the whispers were louder. The market tiers above the hall went quiet in the way they only went quiet before a war. Her father, who tended the moon's heat vents, and rarely spoke of the throne at all, began to keep the family's small flyer fueled and packed, the way he had when Tavi was very young, and a Hunt Lord had passed through the system on a survey. He did not say why. He did not have to. Everyone in the Marches knew that when the throne reaped a human world, the ships of the Wide Hand often did not stop at the one they had been sent to take. A harvest, the Hunt Lord said, was best taken wide. Tavi asked her grandmother why the humans would not simply kneel. The Seleucan had knelt, and the Seleucan had lived, and that seemed to Tavi to be the whole of wisdom. Her grandmother was very old, older than the throne's claim on their moon, and she had 4 soft eyes that had seen a great deal. She did not answer for a long time. Then she said that some peoples did not have a kneel in them, and that the throne had never once met such a people, and lived to call it a mercy. Tavi did not understand what that meant. She would understand it before the 30 days were done. On the screen, the throne showed the human worlds of the Marches, as it wanted them seen. It showed thin cities and small farms, and slow gray ships in low orbit, harmless ships, freighters and water haulers, and a few old patrol cutters that could not have troubled a Hunt Lord's escort. It showed 9 quiet worlds that had no fleet, no fortress, no weapon the throne scanners could find. And it asked the galaxy a simple question. What could a people like this possibly answer with? The galaxy had no answer either. Tavi's whole moon looked at those 9 harmless worlds and saw exactly what the throne wanted it to see, which was prey that had not yet understood it was prey. On the 10th day, the High Cantor lost his patience. Tavi watched it happen on the broad screen, because the throne broadcast everything. The throne believed that fear was a kind of harvest too. The High Cantor was a tall, pale figure wrapped in white, his voice smooth as poured oil, and he looked into every eye in 40 systems, and he said that the humans had spat on mercy, and so mercy was withdrawn. He gave the order to the Cantor's wide hand. He sent the killing fleet to the nearest human world, a place the humans called Marrow's Garden, 90,000 souls on a green moon, and he told the galaxy to watch. Tavi's people watched. They had no choice. Everyone within reach of a screen watched, and Tavi sat between her grandmother and her small cold fear, and she watched 8,000 ships of the Cantor's wide hand fold into the dark above Marrow's Garden and arrange themselves into the closing fist shape that meant a world was about to stop making sound. What happened next did not look like a battle. Tavi had seen recordings of the throne's wars, and they all looked the same. The fist closed, the world went dark, the screen filled with the slow red blooms of a planet's cities dying one after another, and then there was the silence the Hunt Lords loved. That was what everyone in the listening hall expected. That was what the throne expected. That was the entire reason the order had been broadcast, so that 40 systems could see what disobedience cost and choose, every one of them, to kneel a little deeper. But the fist did not close. The 8,000 ships hung above Marrow's Garden, and they waited, the way they always waited, for the world to beg. And the world did not beg. And then, very far out, past the green moon, past the cold edge of that system where nothing was supposed to be, something woke up. Tavi did not know yet that she was looking at the thing that would unmake the pale throne. None of them did. On the screen it was only a smudge at first, a grayness against the black, far out beyond the last frozen rock of the system, in the deep cold dark where the throne's maps marked nothing but empty. The smudge did not fold in the way ships folded. It did not arrive. It was simply there, as if it had always been there, waiting under the dark like a stone under deep water, and now the water had been disturbed, and the stone had decided to rise. Tavi watched the smudge and felt the whole hall lean toward it. 3,000 of her people, who had knelt for 200 years, who had taught their children that the throne was a whether you survived and never a thing you fought, leaned toward a gray shape in the deep dark and did not breathe. The throne's own scanners turned to look at it, because the broadcast carried whatever the fleet saw, and Tavi watched the numbers beside the smudge try to measure it and fail. The numbers climbed. Then they climbed again. Then they stopped. Not because the thing had stopped growing, but because the scanner had run out of numbers to give it. It was long. That was the first thing the failing numbers said. It was longer than any ship the throne had ever logged, longer than the Cantor's own flagship, longer than the listening hall and the market tiers, and the whole carved face of the tide moon laid end to end. And it was dark, not dark as in unlit, but dark as in built to be unseen, a hull that gave back no shine, that drank the light of the green moon and the cold stars and returned nothing, so that the eye kept sliding off it, and the mind kept refusing it. The throne's scanners read its heat, because heat could not be hidden, and the heat said the thing was old and cold, and had been holding very still for a very long time, and that it was now, slowly, terribly, beginning to warm. Her grandmother leaned close to the screen with all 4 eyes wide, reading the heat of the thing through the glass, and Tavi heard her grandmother make a sound she had never heard her make before. It was a small sound, low in the chest, the sound a Salukan made when something very old and very buried turned over in the deep. And her grandmother said one word, very quietly, in a tongue Tavi did not know the humans had taught anyone. She said, Vanguard. The word her grandmother used was human, but it was older than the humans Tavi knew. It was a word the humans had brought with them 60 years before, and given quietly to the few peoples they trusted, and it meant the ones who go first into the dark, so the rest do not have to. It meant the edge of the blade that the body never sees. It meant vanguard. Tavi did not know yet that the humans of the Marches had a second fleet. No one in the galaxy knew. That was the entire point of it. The throne's spies had counted the human worlds, and counted the human ships, and found 9 quiet colonies, and a scatter of freighters, and a handful of old cutters, and they had reported, correctly, that the humans of the Marches could not field a war fleet worth the name. And they had been right. The humans of the Marches could not. What the spies had not counted, because it could not be counted, because it had been built precisely so that it never would be, was the thing that now hung in the cold dark past Marrow's garden and warmed itself toward waking. The humans called it the Long Dark. It was not a fleet of bright ships meant to be seen and feared. It was the other kind of fleet, the kind a careful people builds and then hides, and then prays it never has to use. It had been laid down in deep yards beyond the last frozen world of the Marches, in the black, where the throne's maps said nothing was, and it had been built over 40 patient years by people who smiled and farmed and welcomed the throne's surveyors and let themselves be counted as harmless. It was 900 ships. Every one of them was dark-hulled and cold-running and longer than a Hunt Lord's flagship, and it had been built around one single understanding, which the humans had learned the hard way on 100 worlds before they ever reached the Marches, that a people which is told to kneel must be able to answer in a way the asker never forgets. The Long Dark did not fight the way the throne fought, and that was the whole secret of it. The throne fought by mass, 80,000 ships in the Cantor's wide hand, and behind them the Hunt Lords with their own harvest packs, and behind them the foundry worlds that could replace any ship lost faster than an enemy could kill it. The throne won by being too large to bleed. It had never lost a war because it had never had to win one. It had only ever had to outlast, to close the fist slowly and let weight do the work. And in 200 years, no one had ever made the weight matter quickly enough to change the sum. The humans of the Marches had studied that sum for 60 years, and they had decided not to argue with it. They could not build 80,000 ships. They could not match the foundry worlds, so they had not tried. Instead, they had built 900 ships that did one thing the throne's ships could not do, and they had built them in the dark, so the throne would never think to ask whether it was possible. Every ship of the Long Dark carried, along its full dark length, a weapon the humans called a draw. It was not a beam, and it was not a missile, and it was not anything the throne had a word for. It was a thing that reached out and took a ship's own drive heart, the boiling caged sun that every void ship carried to fold space. And it asked that caged sun a single quiet question, and the question was, what if you were free? And the caged sun, which had wanted nothing else since the day it was lit, always answered the same way. It was a terrible weapon. The humans of the Marches knew it was terrible. They had argued about it for 40 years in the deep yards, the way good people argue about a thing they have decided they must build, and in the end, they had built it and sealed it and prayed never to use it, and they had written one rule around it, in letters, as cold as the dark it slept in. The draw was never to be used first. It was never to be used on a ship that was leaving. It was only ever to be the answer, never the question, the throne asked. The Long Dark answered. That was the rule, and the humans of the Marches had kept it through 9 years of cold vigil, while the throne sharpened its knives above their farms, because keeping the rule was the only thing that made them different from the thing across the dark, and the difference was the only thing worth 9 years in the cold. The flagship of the Long Dark was named the Last Lantern, and she was 11 kilometers from bow to stern, and she had been holding station in the cold past Marrow's garden for 9 years, dark and still, waiting for exactly one thing. She was waiting for the throne to make the surrender order, and then to break it, because the humans of the Marches had read the throne very carefully over 60 quiet years, and they had understood something about it that the throne did not understand about itself. The throne could not simply take. It had to be obeyed first. It had to broadcast the order and watch the kneeling, because the kneeling was the harvest the throne truly fed on, and so the humans had given the throne exactly what it wanted. They had let it make the order. They had let it broadcast the order to 40 systems. They had let it gather 8,000 ships above a human world while the entire galaxy watched. They had let the throne assemble its own witnesses. On the bridge of the Last Lantern, the captain of the Long Dark watched the same 8,000 ships that Tavi watched, on a screen that did not flatter them. Her name was Vera Sandoval, and she had been awake and cold-cycled aboard the last lantern for the full 9 years of the vigil, sleeping the slow sleep between watches, waking to check the dark, sleeping again. She was 41 years old by the clock, and older than that by the dark. She had a steady voice, and tired eyes, and a way of speaking to her crew, as if every order were a small favor she was asking, and they were free to refuse. They never refused. There were 600 of them across the 900 ships, because the long dark ran lean and cold and crude light, and every one of them had volunteered for a vigil that might never end, in ships that might never warm, for a single hour that might never come. The hour had come. Captain Sandoval watched the Cantor's wide hand close above Merrow's garden, and she watched the green moon refuse to beg, and she waited, because the order had to be broken first. She would not move while the order still stood. The humans of the marches had made a rule for themselves, written into the cold heart of the long dark, and the rule was that the lantern slept while the word of mercy still held. The throne had said, "Kneel and live." Until the throne struck the world that had not knelt, the throne had not yet broken its own word, and the long dark would not be the first to break a word. It was a small thing. It was the difference, Sandoval often thought, between the throne and the people the throne hunted. The throne broke its word the moment the word stopped being useful. The humans of the marches kept theirs, even when keeping it cost them, especially then. So she waited for the throne to strike. The throne struck. The High Cantor, far away on his pale world, gave the order to begin the harvest of Merrow's garden, and the lead ships of the Cantor's wide hand opened their throats and put the first lances of fire down through the green moon's thin sky toward a city of 40,000 human souls on the shore of a long blue lake. The throne broke its own word in front of 40 systems. It struck a world that had been promised it would not burn if it knelt, and it struck without waiting to see whether the world would kneel, because the throne had never truly meant the offer. The offer had always been a way to make the kneeling feel like a choice. The harvest had always been coming. The lances of fire never reached the city. Captain Sandoval did not raise her voice. She had been told once, long ago, by a man she had loved, who had died under a different throne, on a different world, that the loudest thing a person could do was speak quietly when everyone expected screaming. So when the throne broke its word, she leaned toward the old-shaped metal microphone on the arm of her chair, the kind the long dark used because it could not be jammed or read or stopped, and she said, to 900 dark ships that had slept for 9 years in the cold, 4 words. She said, "The word is broken." And the long dark woke up. Tavi, in the listening hall, 90 million kilometers away, saw the waking as the throne's scanners saw it, and it was the most frightening thing she had ever seen, and she could not look away from it. The single gray smudge past Merrow's garden did not grow into 900 ships, it simply became 900 ships. All at once, between one breath and the next, as if the dark itself had been a curtain, and the curtain had been pulled. They had been there the whole time. They had been holding station in a cold, close formation that gave back no light, and no heat the scanners could resolve, and now they warmed, and they spread, and the dark gave them up. 900 dark-hulled war vessels longer than the throne's flagship, and the throne's scanners ran out of numbers all over again, 900 times at once. The Cantor's wide hand stopped firing on Merrow's garden. Tavi saw the lances of fire die in the green moon sky, halfway to the city of 40,000, and never fall. The 8,000 ships of the killing fleet turned, all together, for by the way a closing fist turns, when it realizes there is something behind it, and they faced the dark, and the dark faced them back. And then Captain Sandoval did a thing that no one in 40 systems expected, least of all the throne. She did not fire, she spoke. She opened a channel to the Cantor's wide hand, to the whole 8,000. On the open band the throne used to broadcast its harvests, so the galaxy could watch, the very band the throne had chosen, so that fear could spread. She took the throne's own band, and she spoke into it, calmly, in the throne's own tongue, which the humans of the marches had learned the way they learned everything, quietly and completely. And Tavi, in the listening hall, heard a human voice come out of the broad screen for the first time in her life, and it was not a roar, and it was not a plea. It was a woman's voice, level and tired and almost gentle, and it said this. It said, You were offered a surrender, and you refused it, and now I am offering you one. The listening hall did not understand. Tavi did not understand. The throne, by all the records that survived, did not understand either, because the throne had no place in its great role for a thing like this. The throne gave surrender. The throne did not receive it. In 200 years, no people had ever turned the word back on the throne, because no people had ever held a thing the throne needed to fear. And now a human voice on the throne's own band was offering the cantor's wide hand, the very mercy the throne had pretended to offer the humans, and the offer was real, and the offer had a clock. Captain Sandoval gave the cantor's wide hand 60 seconds. She said it plainly. She said that the 8,000 ships above Marrow's garden could power down their weapons and fold away from the human worlds and carry word back to the Pale Throne. All of them, every soul aboard, alive, and that not one of them would be touched if they went. She said it the way you would offer a frightened animal a way out of a trap, with no anger in it, because anger was a luxury, and the long dark did not carry any. And she said that if the 60 seconds passed and the wide hand had not begun to leave, the long dark would show the galaxy why it was called the long dark, and the throne would learn the word the humans of the marches had carried across 100 worlds, the word that meant the ones who go first into the dark, so the rest do not have to. The 60 seconds began. Tavi watched the clock the throne itself put on the broad screen, because the throne broadcast everything, even this, even its own undoing, because it could not imagine yet that this was its undoing. The throne expected the human ships to fire, and the wide hand to grind them down by sheer weight. 8,000 against 900, the way the throne had always won, by being more. The throne did not understand that the long dark had not been built to be more. It had been built to be enough. There is a difference, and the throne was about to learn it, and so was Tavi, and so was every soul in 40 systems watching the throne's own broadcast of the throne's own end. On the bridge of the Cantor's flagship, far above Marrow's garden, the fleet lord who commanded the wide hand made the choice that the throne had trained into him over a lifetime, the only choice the throne permitted, the choice that had always worked before. He did not take the mercy. He could not. The throne did not have a kneel in it, any more than the humans did. But where the humans' refusal to kneel was a kind of spine, the throne's was only a kind of blindness. The fleet lord saw 900 ships where he had expected 9 quiet farming worlds, and he did the only sum the throne had ever taught him, 8,000 against 900, and he liked his sum, and he gave the order to close the fist on the long dark, and crush it, and then finish the green moon, and then, because a harvest was best taken wide, finish the 8 worlds beyond it too. The 60 seconds passed. Captain Sandoval did not say anything cruel. She did not gloat, and she did not curse, and she did not make a speech, because the humans of the marches did not believe in speeches at the edge of the blade. She simply closed the channel she had opened on the throne's own band, so that the last thing the galaxy heard from her before the dark spoke was the small click of a human turning off a microphone. And then she leaned back in her cold chair aboard the 11-kilometer last lantern, and she looked at the 8,000 ships that had refused the mercy she had freely offered, and she said, to her own crew, on her own band, 3 words. She said, "All right then." It did not look like firing. That was the first thing Tavi noticed, in the listening hall, with 3,000 of her people holding their breath around her. When the throne fought, the dark filled with light, with the long red lances, and the white blooms, and the slow-falling fire that everyone had seen in 100 broadcasts. The long dark made no light at all. 900 dark ships reached out across the gap toward 8,000 bright ones, and there was a moment when nothing seemed to happen, a moment so long that the fleet lord of the wide hand, on his bright flagship, must have begun to believe the human threat had been a bluff. Then the first ship of the Cantor's wide hand simply stopped being a ship. It did not explode the way the throne's enemies exploded. It did not burn or break or bloom. Its caged sun heard the human question, and the caged sun answered, and the caged sun came free, all of it, all at once, the whole boiling heart of a void ship unbound in a single instant. There was a flash, brief and very white and gone, and where a ship had been, there was nothing. Not wreckage, not a hull, not a single living soul to drift in the cold. The ship had been there, and then the ship had not, and the dark closed over the place where it had been, as if it had never sailed at all. Tavi made a small sound. She could not help it. Around her, the whole listening hall made the same sound. 3,000 throats, because they were watching a thing no one in 40 systems had ever seen, which was a ship of the Cantor's wide hand, dying without a fight, without a chance, without even the time to be afraid. And then it happened again, and again. And then it happened 900 times at once, and then 900 times again, faster than Tavi could count, faster than the throne's own scanners could log. The dark above Marrow's garden filled not with light, but with absences, with little white blinks where ships had been, blink and blink and blink. And each blink was 400 souls who had refused a free mercy, and a Fleet Lord's sum that no longer added up. The Cantor's wide hand did not break. It was unmade. There is a difference, and the throne learned it that day, and it learned it on its own broadcast band in front of 40 systems it had gathered to teach a lesson. The lesson was learned. It was simply not the lesson the throne had meant to teach. The Fleet Lord of the Wide Hand tried to fight back, because he was brave in the way the throne understood bravery, which was a refusal to understand that the sum had changed. His 8,000 ships opened their throats and put their long lances out across the gap toward the dark ships, and the lances struck the dark ships, and the dark ships did not care. The long dark had been built to be hit. Its dark hulls were not armor in the way the throne understood armor. They were something the humans of the marches had spent 40 years learning, a way of being struck that bled the strike away into the cold, so that a lance that would have gutted a throne ship to the keel struck the last lantern and her sisters, and did little more than warm them, and the long dark, which had been cold for 9 years, did not mind being warmed. So the lances came, and the dark ships took them, and the draws reached back, and the white blinks went on, and the 8,000 became 7,000 became 5, and the Fleet Lord of the Cantor's wide hand watched his unlosable war come apart in his hands, in a matter of minutes, and somewhere in those minutes, the records say, he tried at last to take the mercy that Captain Sandoval had offered, and the clock had closed. He opened the throne's own band, and he began to say the words of surrender, the words his throne had never once permitted him to imagine saying. But the channel he opened was the channel Captain Sandoval had closed, and she did not open it again. She had given the offer once, freely, with no anger in it, and the offer had a clock, and the clock had run, and the humans of the marches kept their words even when keeping them was hard, especially then. The Fleet Lord's surrender went out into the dark and found no one listening, and the white blinks took his flagship last of all, so that the final thing the broadcast carried from the Cantor's wide hand was a Fleet Lord saying the word he had refused to let anyone say to him, into a channel that had already gone quiet. When it was done, the dark above Marrow's garden was empty. 8,000 ships of the throne had folded in to harvest a world of 90,000 souls, and not one of them remained, and not one human ship had been lost, and the green moon's thin sky still held the dying light of the lances that had stopped halfway to a city, lances that would now never fall. 90,000 people on Marrow's garden, who had not knelt, who had been told they were already dead, and simply had not lain down yet, looked up at a sky that the long dark had emptied for them, and they did not cheer, because the humans of the marches were not a cheering people. They simply went back to their lake and their farms and their long blue water, and they began, quietly, to count themselves among the living. But the long dark was not finished. It had answered the breaking of one word above one world. It had 900 ships, and it had a captain who had been cold for 9 years, and it had a throne, far away on a pale world, that had broadcast its own broken word to 40 systems, and now had to live in the galaxy that had watched. Captain Sandoval did not give a speech when the dark went empty. She looked at the place where 8,000 ships had been, and she thought of the man she had loved who had died under a different throne, and she leaned toward the shaped metal microphone one more time, and she gave the long dark its second order of the day. She said, "Set course for the pale throne." And 900 dark ships, longer than the throne's flagship, cold-hulled and patient, and very, very awake, turned together in the empty dark, and began the long fold toward the world that had told the humans of the marches to kneel. The pale throne did not believe the broadcast. That was the strange thing, the thing the chroniclers argued over for years afterward. The throne had broadcast the harvest of Marrow's garden to 40 systems with its own hands. It had watched, through its own scanners, 8,000 ships of the Cantor's wide hand blink out of the dark, one after another. And still, when the news reached the Pale Throne, the High Cantor did not believe it. He could not. There was no column in the Great Roll for a fleet of 80,000 to lose 8,000 ships to 900 farmers in an afternoon. The roll did not have a shape for it, and the High Cantor had spent 200 years believing that the roll was the world. So he decided the broadcast had been a trick, a deception, some human deceit, and he gave the order that the throne always gave when a thing did not fit the roll. He gave the order to make the thing fit. He summoned the rest of the Cantor's wide hand. Not 8,000 ships now, but 70,000 more. The full closing fist of the throne. Every hull the Foundry worlds could spare. And behind them, he summoned the Hunt Lords, who did not come for ordinary wars, and who came now because the High Cantor promised them a harvest unlike any in living memory. He gathered them above the Pale Throne itself, in the bright high orbit of the throne's own world, 70,000 ships and the Hunt Lords' packs, a wall of bright steel that blotted out the stars, and he broadcast the gathering to 40 systems too. Because the throne believed that fear was a harvest, and the throne intended to remind the galaxy that one lost fleet meant nothing against a throne that could field 80,000 more. Tavi watched the gathering on the broad screen in the listening hall, and so did all 3,000 of her people, and so did 40 systems. They watched the bright wall grow above the Pale Throne, ship upon ship upon ship, until the throne's own world was wrapped in a shell of steel so thick that the broadcast could barely show the pale world beneath it. And Tavi felt the old fear come back, because the fear was older than her, and older than her grandmother, and 200 years deep, and the fear said that 900 ships, however terrible, could not stand against 80,000 and the Hunt Lords besides. The fear said that the Long Dark had won a single afternoon, and that the throne would now win the war the way it always won, by being too large to bleed. The fear said, kneel, because the throne is the weather, and you survive it, and you do not fight it. Her grandmother held her 4 hands and said nothing, and watched the bright wall with all 4 eyes, and did not look afraid at all. That frightened Tavi more than the bright wall did. Her grandmother had been afraid of the throne all of Tavi's life. It was the first thing a Seleucan child learned, the careful fear that kept a kneeling people alive, the fear that made you lower your eyes when a Hunt Lord's shadow crossed the moon, and never, never let a wrong word leave your mouth on a broadcast band. Tavi had seen her grandmother lower her eyes 1,000 times. She had never once, in 11 seasons, seen her grandmother look at the throne and feel nothing. And now her grandmother watched 80,000 ships wrap themselves around the throne's own world, and her 4 eyes were calm and dry, and almost, Tavi thought, almost something like waiting, the way you wait for a tide you have known your whole life to finally turn. Tavi's father came to the listening hall on the 2nd hour of the gathering, which he had never done, because the heat vents always needed him, and he did not trust other hands with them. He sat beside his mother and his daughter, and he watched the bright wall grow, and after a long time he said, very quietly, so that only his family could hear, that he had stopped fueling the flyer. Tavi did not understand. He had kept the flyer fueled and packed her whole life, ready to run, because running was the only answer a kneeling people had. Her father looked at the broad screen, and at the 900 cold shapes that had not yet arrived, but that everyone now knew were coming, and he said that there was nowhere left worth running to, because for the first time in 200 years, the running was about to be the throne's. Tavi did not believe him. She wanted to, the way a child wants to believe a parent, but the bright wall above the pale world was too large to argue with, and the old fear was too deep, and so she sat between her father and her grandmother, and watched the throne gather the largest fist it had ever made, and she waited, with the rest of 40 systems, to see the long dark broken. The long dark folded out of the deep dark above the pale throne, 9 hours later, and it folded out in a way the throne had never seen, because the humans of the marches did not arrive the way ships arrived. They did not bloom into the bright high orbit in a wash of fold light for the throne's scanners to count. They came in cold and dark and spread wide, 900 ships easing out of the black at the edge of the throne's own system, longer than the throne's flagship, giving back no light, and for a long moment, the 70,000 ships of the gathered wide hand did not even know they had arrived. The bright wall hung above the pale world, waiting for an enemy to charge it, and the enemy did not charge. The enemy simply assembled itself in the dark at the edge of everything, 900 cold shapes, and waited, and was patient, the way a thing that has been cold for 9 years is patient. Then Captain Sandoval opened the throne's own broadcast band one last time. She did not threaten. Tavi, in the listening hall, heard the same level tired voice she had heard above Marrow's garden, the voice with no anger in it, and the voice spoke to the High Cantor directly, on the band the High Cantor had chosen so that fear could spread, and it said a thing that the throne had no answer for. It said, "You offered us a surrender. We have come to give you ours to sign." And then the voice explained, plainly, with no cruelty, exactly what the High Cantor's choices were, and there were only 2 of them, and they were the same 2 the throne had offered the humans of the marches 30 days before. The throne could lay down its weapons and open its docks and end its claim on the 9 human worlds and the 11 other broken peoples, and never again make a surrender order in all the long years it had left, or it could not. The High Cantor chose not. He chose it the way the throne always chose, because the throne did not have a kneel in it, and where the humans' refusal to kneel was a spine, the throne's was a blindness, and the blindness had a name now, and the name was 80,000 ships. The High Cantor looked at 900 cold shapes at the edge of his system, and he did the only sum the throne had ever taught him, and the sum still came out the same, because the throne could not learn, because learning would have meant admitting that the role was not the world. He gave the order to the gathered wide hand. He gave the order to the Hunt Lords. He told 70,000 ships, and the throne's favored killers, to leave the bright shell around the pale world, and go out into the dark, and crush the 900, and bring him a human captain to kneel before the throne, alive, so that the galaxy could watch her kneel, and forget that it had ever watched the throne bleed. The 70,000 came, and the Hunt Lords came with them, and that was its own kind of terror. Because the Hunt Lords did not fight in lines the way the Wide Hand did. They moved in packs, fast and low and hungry, and they did not aim for a ship's drive or its guns. They aimed for the soft places, the crew decks, and the medical bays and the lifeboats, because the Hunt Lords did not fight to win a battle. They fought to make a people afraid to ever be born again. Tavi had grown up on stories of the Hunt Lords the way human children grew up on stories of things under the bed. Except the things under the bed of the Seleucan marches were real, and they had names, and they had passed through her system once when she was small, and her grandmother had hidden the whole family in the deep heat vents for 9 days until they were gone. Now the Hunt Lords poured out of the bright shell after the Wide Hand, and Tavi felt her grandmother's 4 hands tighten on hers, and for a moment, she thought even her grandmother's strange new calm would break, but it did not. Her grandmother watched the Hunt Lords go out into the dark toward the 900, and she said, very softly, that the throne had just sent its favorite knives to a place where knives did not matter, and that the throne did not know it yet, and that this was the difference between a thing that learned and a thing that only counted. It was the largest thing Tavi had ever seen, and it was the largest thing the broad screen had ever shown, and it was, the chroniclers later agreed, the largest war fleet the Pale Throne had ever sent against a single enemy in all its 200 years. 70,000 ships and the Hunt Lords' packs left the bright shell and poured out into the dark toward the 900, a closing fist 100 times larger than the one the long dark had emptied above Marrow's garden, and behind it, the High Cantor watched, certain, the way the throne was always certain, that the weight would do the work. And the long dark did not run, and the long dark did not charge. It held. Captain Sandoval, on the bridge of the 11-kilometer last lantern, watched 70,000 ships come toward her 900, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not flinch, because she had been cold for 9 years, and the cold had burned all the flinch out of her long ago. She had one thing the High Cantor did not have, and it was not ships, and it was not weapons. It was the thing the humans of the marches had carried across 100 worlds, the thing that had made them build the long dark in the dark, and seal the draw, and pray never to use it, and keep their word even when it cost them. She had the understanding that a people which is told to kneel must answer in a way the asker never forgets, and she had decided, in the cold years of the vigil, exactly what that answer would be when the day came. The answer was not to win quickly. The long dark could have won quickly. 900 draws against 70,000 caged suns would have filled the dark with white blinks for an hour, and then the dark would have been empty, and the throne would have had no fleet at all. But Captain Sandoval did not want a quick win, because a quick win is forgotten, and the humans of the marches did not want to be forgotten. They wanted to be the last surrender order the Pale Throne ever gave, and so Captain Sandoval did a thing that no commander in the throne's 200 years had ever dared, a thing that the High Cantor, watching from his bright shell, could not understand, and would not understand, until it was far too late. She let them in. The 900 ships of the Long Dark held their cold formation at the edge of the throne's system, and they let the 70,000 come, and they did not fire while the fist closed, the way they had not fired above Marrow's garden until the word was broken. They let the throne's whole gathered war fleet pour around them, and over them, and through the gaps between them, 70,000 bright ships swallowing 900 dark ones, until the Long Dark was not facing the wide hand any longer, but standing inside it, deep inside it, surrounded on every side by the largest fleet the throne had ever sent, so deep that there was no edge of the fight anywhere a scanner could find, only throne ships, and throne ships, and throne ships, and 900 cold dark shapes scattered through the middle of all of them, like stones at the bottom of a bright fast river. The High Cantor, watching, believed he had won. Tavi, in the listening hall, believed the throne had won too, and her small cold fear became a large cold fear, because the 900 had let themselves be swallowed, and that could only mean they had made a mistake, and a mistake against the throne meant the end. 3,000 of her people leaned toward the broad screen in the listening hall and watched 900 dark shapes vanish into a sea of 70,000 bright ones, and the whole hall made a low sound of grief, because they thought they were watching the Long Dark die. Her grandmother did not make the sound. Her grandmother leaned close to Tavi and said, in the old soft tongue, "Watch what they do with the inside." Because the throne had spent 200 years fighting from the outside, the throne won by being the wall, the shell, the closing fist that crushed an enemy between its weight and the cold dark beyond. The throne had never once, in all its wars, had an enemy that wanted to be inside the fist. And the draw, the terrible patient weapon the humans of the marches had built in the dark, and sealed and sworn never to use first, did not care where it stood. It reached out and asked a caged sun a single quiet question, and it did not matter whether the caged sun was in front of the Long Dark, or beside it, or behind it, or above it. From the inside of the Cantor's wide hand, every one of the 70,000 caged suns was within reach of a draw. From the inside, there was no formation, and no flank, and no wall. Only a fleet that had wrapped itself, with its own hands, around the very thing it should have run from. The throne had swallowed the Long Dark. The Long Dark had let it. Captain Sandoval waited until the fist was fully closed, until the last gap had filled, until 70,000 bright ships had committed themselves so completely to crushing the 900 that they could no longer pull apart, so densely packed in the bright high dark above the pale world that a ship could not fold away without folding into its own neighbor. She waited until the throne had no edges left, and then, deep inside the largest war fleet the Pale Throne had ever sent, on her own band, to 900 ships that had been cold for 9 years and were now exactly where they had always meant to be, she gave the third order of the war. She did not say all right then. This was not Marrow's garden, and these were not 8,000, and the humans of the marches knew the difference between an afternoon and a reckoning. She leaned toward the shaped metal microphone, deep inside the closed fist of the throne, and she said the word her grandmother had said in the listening hall, the old word the humans had carried across 100 worlds, the word that meant the ones who go first into the dark, so the rest do not have to. She said, "Vanguard." And from the inside of the Cantor's wide hand, the Long Dark began to ask 70,000 caged suns the only question it had ever wanted to ask. What happened inside the Cantor's wide hand did not look like a battle either, and that was the part the chroniclers could never quite make the galaxy understand. There was no front, and no charge, and no long exchange of fire. There was only the slow turning out of 70,000 lights. From the inside, the Long Dark did not need to aim. Every caged sun in the throne's gathered fleet was within reach of a draw, and so the draws simply reached, all of them, in every direction at once. 900 dark ships scattered through the heart of 70,000 bright ones. and the dark began to fill with the little white blinks that Tavi had learned to dread above Marrow's garden. Except now there were not 8,000 of them but 70,000, and they did not come one after another, but in a long, unbroken shimmer, like the surface of a lake when the rain first touches it. Blink, and blink, and blink, and blink, across the whole bright high orbit of the Pale Throne's own world. The Throne's fleet tried to fire back. It could not. That was the trap the humans of the Marches had spent 40 years building toward, the reason they had let themselves be swallowed instead of fighting from the edge. From the inside of its own closed fist, the Cantor's wide hand could not shoot at the 900 without shooting through its own ships. 70,000 hulls packed so densely that a fold would have folded them into their neighbors, and now, every lance a throne ship put out toward a dark shape passed first through 3 or 4 bright ones, so that the wide hand, trying to kill the long dark, mostly killed itself. The throne had built its whole way of war around being the wall, and a wall has an inside, and the humans of the Marches had simply chosen to stand there. The Hunt Lords died first, which surprised everyone, because the Hunt Lords were fast, but fast did not matter against a draw, because a draw did not chase. The Hunt Lords darted through the dark toward the soft places of the 900, looking for crew decks and lifeboats, and they found that the long dark had no soft places, because the long dark had been built by a people who had buried their own crews deep behind dark hulls that bled a strike away into the cold. The Hunt Lords' knives skated off the dark hulls and did nothing, and then the draws asked the Hunt Lords' caged sons the only question they knew, and the throne's favored killers, who had taught 100 peoples to be afraid to be born again, blinked out of the dark in a scatter of little white lights, and were not afraid of anything ever again, and were not anything at all. Tavi watched the Hunt Lords die on the broad screen, and she did not cheer, because she was a Seleucan, and the Seleucan were not a cheering people, but something in her chest, that had been clenched her whole 11 seasons, came slowly, carefully, unclenched. Her grandmother watched the Hunt Lords die with her 4 dry eyes, and she said one word, very quietly, in a tongue Tavi did not know her grandmother knew, and the word was a human word, and it meant enough. As if her grandmother had been waiting her whole long life to say it, and was glad, at last, to have somewhere to put it down. There was a moment, the records say, when the fleet lords of the wide hand understood what had been done to them, and it came too late to matter, the way it always came too late for the throne. Somewhere in the long shimmer of dying lights, the commanders of the throne's gathered fleet realized that the 900 had not been swallowed, they had been swallowed by. They realized that every ship they had packed around the long dark to crush it had instead become a caged sun within reach of a draw, that the densest part of the throne's own formation was the most dangerous place in the whole dark to stand, that the fist had closed around its own knife, and so they tried, all at once, to do the one thing that might have saved 1/10 of them. They tried to pull apart. They tried to open the fist. They could not. They had packed themselves too tightly, 70,000, and then 80,000 hulls, in a space meant for far fewer, committed so completely to the crushing that there was nowhere to pull apart to. A ship that tried to fold away, folded into its neighbor. A ship that tried to run, ran into the side of the ship beside it. The Cantor's wide hand, which had spent 200 years being the wall that crushed an enemy against the cold dark, found that it had finally met an enemy that wanted to be the thing inside the wall, and that a wall, once closed, cannot open fast enough to matter. The throne had built its strength out of weight, and weight, the humans of the Marches had understood for 60 quiet years, is the slowest thing in the dark to change its mind. So the fleet tried to pull apart and could not, and the draws kept reaching, and the long shimmer of white blinks rolled on across the high orbit of the Pale Throne, and the throne's whole way of war died in the place it had always been strongest, in the heart of its own closed fist, above its own naked world. It was, the chroniclers later agreed, the most one-sided reckoning ever recorded in 40 systems, and the strangest part of it was how quiet it was. There was no roar. The throne had built its wars out of light and noise, the long red lances and the white blooms and the slow-falling fire, all of it loud, all of it meant to be seen, because the throne fought as much to terrify the watchers as to beat the enemy. The long dark fought in near silence. 900 dark ships moved through the heart of 80,000 bright ones and made almost no light at all, only the brief white blinks of caged suns coming free, blink after blink after blink, a reckoning that looked, on the broad screen, less like a battle than like a vast dark hand slowly turning off a sky full of lamps. Tavi never forgot the quiet of it. She had braced for thunder, the way you brace for the worst thing you have ever seen, and instead she watched the largest war fleet in the throne's history go out like a held breath, one light at a time, in a silence so complete that the listening hall itself fell silent to match it. 3,000 of her people holding still, holding quiet, watching the dark do its patient work above a naked world. The 70,000 became 50,000 became 30. Captain Sandoval did not hurry. She had not come for an afternoon. She had come for a reckoning, and a reckoning is a thing you do all the way, with care, so that it is remembered. The long dark moved through the heart of the throne's broken fleet at the pace of a tide, dark and patient and cold, and it asked the caged suns their question one wave at a time, and the white blinks rolled across the high orbit of the pale throne, in long shimmering bands, and the high cantor, on his pale world below, watched his unlosable fleet turn out like a sky full of dying stars, and still, could not make it fit the role. He did the only thing the throne knew how to do when a thing did not fit. He tried to make it fit. He gave the order to the foundry worlds to build more. He gave the order to the last reserves, the home guard of the pale throne itself, the 10,000 ships that had never left the bright shell, because the throne's own world was the one place that never needed defending. He threw the home guard out into the dying orbit too, 10,000 more bright ships into the long shimmer of white blinks, and the home guard reached the heart of the fight and found the long dark waiting there, cold and unhurried, and the home guard's caged sons heard the question, and the home guard joined the dying stars. And then, for the first time in 200 years, the bright shell around the pale throne was gone. The pale world hung in the dark, naked, unwrapped, its 80,000 ships and its hunt lords and its home guard all turned out into the long shimmer of white, and the long dark, 900 cold ships and not one of them lost, settled into the high orbit above the throne's own world, and looked down at the pale world that had told the humans of the marches to kneel. Tavi waited for the long dark to burn it. She was a child of a kneeling people, and she knew how wars ended, because the throne had taught her. A war ended when the winner did to the loser what the loser had meant to do to everyone else. A war ended with the slow red blooms of a world's cities dying one after another, with the silence the hunt lords loved. Tavi had watched the throne end 11 peoples that way on the broad screen, and she braced herself, with all of 40 systems, to watch the humans of the marches end the pale throne the same way, because that was what winners did, because that was the only ending she knew. The long dark did not burn the pale throne. Captain Sandoval opened the throne's own broadcast band one final time, the band the High Cantor had chosen so that fear could spread, and into it she put a thing that the throne had no column for, a thing that 40 systems had never once heard a winner say. She did not demand a kneeling. She did not demand a tithe people, or a closed number, or a stamped surrender. She spoke to the High Cantor on his naked world, in his own tongue, with the same level tired voice she had carried through the whole long day, and she said this. She said, "You have nothing left to threaten anyone with. That is all we came to take." And then she explained, plainly, with no cruelty and no triumph, exactly what the throne's choices were now, and there were two of them, and they were not the two the throne had offered the humans of the marches 30 days before. The throne could not kneel. The long dark had not come for a kneeling, and a kneeling could be taken back the moment the dark ships left. Instead, the throne would do a harder thing. The thing the humans of the marches had decided, in the cold years of the vigil, was the only ending worth 9 years of cold. The throne would open every closed number in its great roll. It would unmake every claim. It would send word to the 11 broken peoples, and the 9 human worlds, and every tithe folk in 40 systems, that the pale throne released them, all of them, with its own hands, on its own broadcast band, in front of the whole galaxy that had gathered to watch the humans kneel. Or the High Cantor could refuse, and the long dark would not burn his world, because burning worlds was the throne's trade, and not the humans, but the long dark would stay. It would settle into the high orbit of the pale throne, and it would never leave. 900 cold dark ships longer than the throne's flagship, holding the throne's own sky forever, so that the throne, which had spent 200 years teaching 40 systems to be afraid, would spend the rest of its years living under a fear it could never once make smaller, never threaten, never harvest, never understand. A throne with nothing left to threaten with, watched by the dark, until it simply, quietly, stopped being a throne at all. The High Cantor was silent for a long time. Tavi watched the silence stretch across the broad screen, and she realized she was holding her grandmother's 4 hands so tightly that it must have hurt, and her grandmother did not pull away. 40 systems held that silence together. The whole galaxy, which had been gathered by the throne to watch a people kneel, watched a throne find out that it had no kneel in it either, and discover, far too late, that this had never been a strength. And then the High Cantor, on his naked pale world, with nothing left to threaten anyone in all the dark, made the choice the throne had never once made in 200 years. He opened the great roll. Tavi watched him do it on the broad screen, his smooth oiled voice gone thin and strange, and she heard him begin to read out the closed numbers, the broken peoples, one after another, releasing them, unmaking the claims, because the only thing left to him was the choosing of which ending was worse, a throne that released the galaxy, or a throne watched by the dark forever, and even a thing that only counted could count that far. He tried, once, in the middle of the reading, to make it a trick. The throne could not help itself. The trick was the only tool it had ever owned. He paused over one of the closed numbers, a people called the Vothi who had been broken 60 years before, and instead of releasing them he began, in his thin, strange voice, to lay a condition on the release, to make the freedom a leash, the way the surrender order had made mercy a hook. He had done it 10,000 times. It was the oldest move in the Great Roll, the move that turned every gift into a debt, and every debt into a column. Captain Sandoval did not let him finish the sentence. She did not raise her voice. She simply said, on the throne's own band, that the dark was patient, and the long dark was very awake, and that the high orbit of the pale throne was a fine cold place to hold station for 100 years, if the High Cantor preferred it, and that he should choose his next words, knowing that 900 ships had been built specifically to outweight a thing that thought it could not be outweighted. And the High Cantor, who had spent 200 years being the most patient cruelty in 40 systems, met a patience colder and older, and entirely without cruelty, and he understood, at last, that he had lost the one game the throne had always won, the waiting game, because the humans of the marches had spent 9 years in the cold, learning to want nothing, and a thing that wants nothing cannot be made to settle for less. He released the Vothi without a condition. He released the next people without a condition. He did not try the trick again. He read for a long time. There were a great many closed numbers. The throne had been busy for 200 years. And across 40 systems, as the High Cantor read, the broken peoples heard their own names come back to them. The Vothi, who had not been called the Vothi on any throne band in 60 years, who had been only a column, heard a throne say their name and unsay its claim, and somewhere on a far gray world, a people that had forgotten how to be a people began, slowly, to remember. The 11 broken folk heard themselves released one after another, and the 9 human worlds heard their farms and their lakes and their long blue water given back, and the tithe peoples of 40 systems heard the throne let go of leashes it had held longer than most of them had been alive. The whole galaxy, gathered by the throne to watch a kneeling, watched instead the largest unkneeling there had ever been, read aloud by the throne's own thin and broken voice, on the throne's own band, with 900 cold dark ships holding the throne's own sky. And as he read, in the listening hall carved into the side of a tide moon, 90 million kilometers from the naked pale world, 3,000 of Tavi's people, who had knelt for 200 years, began very slowly to stand up, not to cheer. The Salukan were not a cheering people. They stood the way you stand, when something that has been pressing on you your whole life is lifted, when your spine remembers a shape it had forgotten it could make, when a tide you have known since birth at last, turns. Tavi's father stood, and Tavi's grandmother stood, slow and creaking, and 140 seasons old, and Tavi stood between them, 11 seasons old, and watched a human voice on a human band give a kneeling people back their own backs. Her grandmother looked down at her with all 4 soft eyes, and there was water in them, which Tavi had never seen, not once in 11 seasons, and her grandmother said the human word one more time, the old word, the word the humans had carried across 100 worlds and given quietly to the few peoples they trusted. She said, Vanguard. The ones who go first into the dark, she said, so the rest of us do not have to. When the High Cantor finished reading, the listening hall was silent, and 40 systems were silent, and the pale throne hung naked in the dark above its own broken sky, and for a long moment, nothing in the whole galaxy moved at all. Then Captain Sandoval, on the throne's own band, said the last thing the humans of the marches had ever planned to say, and it was not a threat, and it was not a curse, and it was not a boast. It was an answer to the surrender order, the one the throne had broadcast to 40 systems 30 days before, the one everyone had called generous. She said that the throne had offered the humans of the marches a choice between kneeling and burning, and that the humans had thought about it for 30 days, and that this was their reply. And then she said the part that Tavi would carry for the rest of her long life, the part that the chroniclers wrote down word for word, the part that 40 systems repeated to their children for 100 years afterward. She said, "We will not kneel, and we will not burn you, because we are not you. We will simply make it so that no one ever has to choose again." And then she closed the channel, and the small click of a human turning off a microphone went out across 40 systems for the last time, and the long dark began to leave. It did not leave the way it had come. It had come in cold and dark and unseen, a smudge in the deep, a stone rising under deep water. It left in the open, slow and plain, 900 dark ships, longer than the throne's flagship, lifting out of the high orbit of the pale throne, one after another, in no hurry, hiding from no one, because there was no longer anyone in 40 systems who needed to be hidden from. The throne watched them go. The throne could do nothing else. It had no fleet, and no hunt lords, and no home guard, and no closed numbers, and nothing left to threaten anyone with, which Captain Sandoval had said, at the very start, was all the humans had come to take. The throne kept its world. It kept its pale, tall figure in white, and its smooth, oiled voice, and its great empty role. It simply stopped being a thing that 40 systems were afraid of, and a throne that no one is afraid of is not a throne for very long. Tavi watched the long dark go, and she watched it the whole way, until the last cold dark shape folded out beyond the edge of the broad screen and was gone, back toward the 9 quiet human worlds along the Seleucan marches, back toward the deep yards beyond the last frozen world, back, she supposed, into the dark where it would wait again. Because that was what a vanguard did. It went first into the dark so the rest did not have to, and then, when the dark was answered, it went back into the dark and waited, in case the dark ever needed answering again. It did not stay to be thanked. The humans of the marches were not a people who stayed to be thanked. They had built the long dark to be the last surrender order the Pale Throne ever gave, and they had made it so, and then they had gone home to their farms and their lakes and their long blue water, and asked nothing, and taken nothing, and left a galaxy that would never again mistake a quiet people for a kneeling one. The years that followed were strange and good, and Tavi lived through all of them. The Pale Throne diminished the way the humans had known it would, slowly, without a single shot, because a thing that rules by fear cannot survive the day the fear ends. The 11 broken peoples, released by the throne's own voice, did not come back to it. The 9 human worlds along the marches went on being quiet and clean and harmless looking, and no one in 40 systems ever again made the mistake of thinking that harmless looking meant harmless. The High Cantor lived out his years on his naked pale world, with his great empty role, and the galaxy, which had once gathered at his command to watch other peoples kneel, simply stopped gathering, and stopped watching, and in the end forgot, which is the only thing a throne built on fear truly cannot survive. There was a story, in the years after, that the High Cantor sent one message to the humans of the marches before the end. No one ever proved it true, but the freed peoples told it anyway, because it had the right shape. The story said that the High Cantor, alone on his world with his empty role, sent a single quiet question across the dark to the 9 human worlds, and the question was the only one a throne could think to ask. He asked why. He had 80,000 ships and the hunt lords, and 200 years. And the humans had 9 quiet farms and a fleet built in the dark, and he could not understand, even at the end, why a people that small had not simply taken his place, why the long dark had not settled into his sky and harvested 40 systems for itself, the way any throne would have, why a fleet that could empty the heavens had emptied them once and gone home. And the story said that the humans of the marches answered him, and that the answer was short, and that it was the same level tired voice that had carried through the whole long day, and that it said only this. It said, "Because we were never trying to win your throne. We were only ever trying to make sure no one needed it." And then, the story said, the channel closed with the small click of a human turning off a microphone, and the High Cantor was alone again, more alone than any throne had ever been, with the one true answer he could not fit into any column of his great and empty role. The humans never confirmed the story, and they never denied it, and they never spoke of the war at all to anyone who asked. The captain of the Long Dark, the tired-voiced woman who had offered a free mercy twice and meant it both times, went back to the 9 quiet worlds and was never broadcast again, and 40 systems only ever learned her name years later, from the Vothi, who had thought to ask. Vera Sandoval. The freed peoples carved it into a stone on a far gray world, the only monument the humans of the marches ever allowed anyone to raise, and below the name, they carved no titles and no battles and no count of ships, only the human word, the old one, the one she had taught a galaxy, Vanguard. The ones who go first into the dark so the rest do not have to. In the first year after, the freed peoples came to find one another. This was a thing the throne had made impossible for 200 years. A tithe folk did not travel. A tithe folk stayed in its column, and built its ships, and grew its grain, and kept its eyes down. The broken peoples of 40 systems had lived as islands, each one alone in its own fear, each one certain it was the only one the throne had ever truly broken. And then the throne released them all in a single afternoon, with its own thin voice, and the islands discovered that there had been an ocean of them all along. Tavi was young when the first Vothi ship came to the Seleucan marches. It was a small ship, a slow gray thing, built by a people who had only just been allowed to remember they were a people, and it carried no weapons, because the Vothi had not been permitted weapons in 60 years. It came down onto the tide moon, and a delegation of the Vothi stepped out, gray and tall and strange, and they had come, they said, for one reason only. They had come to ask the Seleucan whether the human word was true, whether there was really a fleet in the dark, whether the promise the human captain had made on the throne's own band, that no quiet people would ever again have to answer a throne alone, was a thing a people could lean their whole frightened weight against, or only a thing that had been said once, beautifully, on a day when saying it was easy. Tavi's grandmother answered them. She was very old by then, and she came out onto the cold terrace to meet the Vothi, and she told them what she had seen with her own 4 eyes from the listening hall. She told them about the smudge in the deep dark, and the numbers that ran out, and the free mercy offered twice and refused twice, and the long shimmer of white blinks across the throne's own sky. And then she told them the thing she had come to understand, which was that the promise was true, but that it was not the kind of promise you leaned your weight against. It was the kind you stood up straight beside. The long dark had not freed the marches so that the marches could go on being afraid in a more comfortable way. It had freed them so that they could stop. The promise was not that the dark would always fight for you. The promise was that you would never again be alone in deciding not to kneel, and that this, the not being alone, was the whole of what a free people ever truly needed. The Vothi took that answer home with them. And the next year there were 2 ships, and the year after there were a dozen. And the freed peoples of 40 systems began, slowly and carefully, and with a great deal of fear still in them, to find one another across the dark the throne had kept them islanded in. They did not build an empire. None of them ever wanted one again. They had all seen, up close, exactly what an empire cost. They built something the chroniclers never found a single clean word for, a loose and quiet web of peoples who had each, separately, been told to kneel, and who had each, separately, been answered, and who had decided, together, that they would simply keep an eye on the dark for one another, the way the humans had taught them, so that no quiet folk anywhere along the old throne lanes would ever again look up at a generous order and believe it was the only choice they had. And the Seleucan, who had knelt for 200 years, slowly forgot how to kneel. It did not happen all at once. 200 years of careful fear do not leave a people in a day, but Tavi watched it go, season by season, across her own long life. She watched her grandmother stop lowering her eyes when a ship passed overhead, because there were no more hunt lords to lower them for. She watched her father stop keeping the flyer fueled and packed, and then watched him take the flyer apart entirely and use its good metal to build a new wing onto the heatworks, because there was nowhere left worth running to. And for the first time in 200 years, that was a glad thing, and not a hopeless one. She watched the marketeers above the listening hall grow loud again, loud in a way they had never been in her childhood, the careful quiet of a kneeling people slowly becoming the ordinary noise of a free one. She watched children younger than she had been at the gathering grow up without the first lesson she had been taught, the careful fear, the lowered eyes, the wrong word that must never leave your mouth on a broadcast band. They did not learn it. There was no one left to teach it to them, and nothing left to teach it for. Tavi told them the story instead. She told it in the listening hall, the same bowl of pale stone carved into the side of the tide moon, when she was old enough to be the one telling and not the one listening. She told the children how the throne had broadcast its generous order to 40 systems, and how the humans had said nothing for 10 days, and how everyone, even her own wise grandmother, had been certain the humans were already dead and simply had not lain down yet. She told them about the smudge in the deep dark past Marrow's garden, and the numbers that ran out, and the long dark shape that drank the light. She told them about a tired voice with no anger in it, offering a free mercy that was refused, and about a fleet that let itself be swallowed so that it could answer from the inside, and about the long shimmer of white blinks rolling across the throne's own sky. And she told them the last thing the human captain had said, the part she had carried her whole life, that we will not kneel, and we will not burn you, because we are not you, and that we will simply make it so that no one ever has to choose again. And then she told them the part that mattered most, the part she had only understood when she was very old, and her grandmother was long in the ground. She told them that the throne had thought a surrender order was a generous thing, and that everyone in 40 systems had agreed, and that the humans of the marches had understood something none of them understood, which was that there is no generous way to tell a free people to kneel. The kindness was the trap. The mercy was the hook. A throne that offers you the choice between kneeling and burning has already decided you are a thing that can be made to choose, and the only true answer to such a throne, the humans had decided in 9 cold years of vigil, is to be the kind of people who cannot be made to choose at all. Not because they are cruel. The humans had not been cruel. They had offered the throne's own fleet a free mercy twice, and meant it both times, but because they had built, in the dark, with their own hands, over 40 patient years, a thing that made the question impossible to ask twice. They had not won the war by being larger than the throne. They had won it by being a people the throne could not imagine, and then by being patient enough to wait, cold and dark and unseen, until the throne imagined wrong out loud, in front of 40 systems, and broke its own word, and gave the long dark leave to answer. That, Tavi told the children, is what the human word meant. Vanguard. The ones who go first into the dark so the rest do not have to. Not the ones who rule the dark. Not the ones who claim it, or harvest it, or write it into a roll. The ones who go first into it, and answer what is waiting there, and then come back out, and go home and ask for nothing, and leave you free to be afraid of nothing, including them. The children always ask the same question, every season, every telling. They asked whether the long dark was still out there, in the deep yards beyond the last frozen world, cold and dark and waiting. And Tavi always gave them the same answer, the true one, the one her father had given her when she was small, and the bright wall hung above the pale world, and she had been so afraid. She told them yes. She told them that 900 dark ships longer than any throne's flagship still slept in the cold, past the edge of everything, crude light and cold running, and very, very patient, waiting for exactly one thing, the way they had always waited, not for a war. The humans of the marches did not want a war. They had built the long dark precisely so they would never have to fight one again. They were waiting for the day some new throne, somewhere in the wide dark, looked at a quiet people, and a few harmless ships, and a scatter of clean farms, and decided that quiet meant kneeling, and sent out a generous order to a people who did not have a kneel in them. They were waiting. the way a stone waits under deep water, for the water to be disturbed. And on the day it was, Tavi told the children, the dark would rise. It always would. That was the promise the humans had made to the Seleucan marches, and to the 11 broken peoples, and to every quiet folk in 40 systems, on the day they emptied the throne's sky, and went home, asking nothing. The promise was not that there would never again be a throne that told you to kneel. The promise was that you would never again have to answer it alone. Tavi Ren lived a very long time, longer than her grandmother, longer than 200 years of careful fear had ever let a Seleucan dream of living without lowering her eyes. She saw the marches grow loud and free and unafraid. She saw children who had never once been told to kneel, grow into adults who could not imagine being told. She saw the name of the pale throne pass out of common speech entirely, until the youngest of them had to be told what a throne even was, and why anyone had ever been afraid of one. And on the last clear night of her long life, an old woman, in a free hall on a tide moon, she went up to the high terrace, where the heat vents her father had tended once, breathed warm into the cold, and she looked out past the green moon, and past the cold edge of the system, into the deep dark, where the throne's old maps had marked nothing but empty. She could not see the long dark. No one ever could. That was the whole point of it. But she knew it was there, cold and patient, and awake. 900 dark ships keeping a vigil that had outlasted the throne it was built to answer, keeping it still, keeping it for her grandchildren, and for the broken peoples, and for every quiet folk who had ever been told that quiet meant weak. And Tavi Ren, who had been 11 seasons old and very afraid on the day the surrender order went out across 40 systems, raised her 4 soft eyes to the empty dark that was not empty, and she said the human word one last time, softly, the way her grandmother had said it, the way she had taught it to 100 children who would never need to be afraid. She said, "Vanguard, thank you for going first." And out past the edge of everything, in the deep cold dark where nothing was supposed to be, 900 dark ships kept their long vigil, and warmed by not even a degree, and did not answer, because they did not need to. They had already given their answer. They had given it to 40 systems, on the throne's own band, on the day the galaxy expected a quiet people to kneel, and learned, instead, what it meant when Earth's children chose to be the ones who go first into the dark. The galaxy had asked for a surrender. It had received one. It simply had not understood, until the dark rose and the white blinks rolled across a throne's own sky, whose surrender was being signed. The long dark waited on, patient as the cold, awake as the stars, the last and quietest promise a free people ever made to the dark. It is waiting still,